All right, everyone. So let's look into our layout. How are we building our layout from line 27 to line 310? So almost 300 lines of code, but really you don't need to worry because once you understand the first part, like all of this, it pretty much, it pretty much repeats itself. This is the same, and the third part and the fourth part is the same. So pay attention to the first part because that's the most important thing to know. All right, so in this case, we're going to wrap the whole layout inside a DBC container. DBC stands for dash bootstrap, and when we put everything inside a DBC container, it just looks better. So here, the first thing we're going to do is we need a title. Welcome to the Animal Shelter dApp. So we're going to use HTML H1. This is Python wrapped HTML. This H1 is typically what we consider a header 1, so the biggest font size. We're going to put this in the middle of the page, the center of the page, and that's what you see here, the title. And then we have like a subtitle, and this is going to be header 5, so the font size is smaller, and it's right under the main title. And then we have another HTML H3, add new shelter, but there's an invisible alert. Now this alert is something that you will see when we enter new shelter data. When we enter new shelter data, this alert will be triggered using the callback all the way down here. We'll go over that in the next video. But this alert will be triggered, and it would say something like, successfully inserted your new shelter to the blockchain Polygon. Your shelter ID is 2 or whatever. So you can't really see this right now, but you need to build it so then later you can call it. And if you want to understand what these mean, these properties, just go into the dash bootstrap library, dash bootstrap components library, into the alerts component. I'm going to add this this URL under the video so you can check this out. But this is great because here is all the alert color types. It gives you an example of how to create the DBC alert. It talks about more sophisticated examples with links inside the alerts, how to activate them, alerts with X's that the user can X out, and it just gives you cool examples here in the documentation. But most importantly, it gives you the definition of each property. So if you don't know what duration means, let's look it up. Duration in milliseconds, after which the alert will dismiss itself. So if I put 5,000 milliseconds, that's 5 seconds. So if I activate the alert here, when I submit my shelter, it will trigger the alert, and after 5 seconds, it will disappear. And then the children is what's the text inside the alert. We'll put that inside the callback when the alert is triggered. All right, now we have our first row. Now this is like 60 lines of code, but if you understand how to build this first row, which incorporates all of these things, 3 input fields, 1 set of radio buttons, and a submit button, you will easily understand all the rest that comes after this. So let's go over this DBC row, line 42. We have a few column components where we put everything in there. DBC column, DBC column, DBC column. We have 4 column components because we have 1, 2, oops, up here. 1, 2, 3, and 4 different components, and at the very bottom we have a button. So the first column component, inside of this column component, we're going to say it's going to be 6 columns wide, which is half. Every page will have 12 columns, and if this is 6 columns wide, and the next column component is also 6 columns wide, this is going to be on the left side, and this component will be on the right side. Let's look at the first column component. So the first column component we have right here. We put just a label, HTML label, name. See, it looks different. It's not like an HTML H5 or H3 header. It's a little bit lighter in color. And then we'll put the DBC input. Again, this is just another one of the dash bootstrap components, the DBC input. And the input will say required true. So if this is empty, this will become red, like it requires text. The type is going to be text because the input can be of type number, it could be email, it could be password, but we just want regular text because it's going to be the shelter name. Initial value, if we refresh the page, will be just enter shelter name, just kind of like a prompt to tell the user to insert a shelter name. Just the width of the input field, I want to control the width a little bit more, and the ID. Now you need an ID because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different input fields, but you need to distinguish between them, like which input field is which. The ID will help you distinguish. Insert shelter will be this input field. The second, let's look at the third calling component. This input field will be insert city. This will be the name of the input field, insert city, and so on and so on. So that is so the ID is very important, especially when you use them inside the callback. Now, the second callback component, we have DBC Radio Buttons. I'm going to add this link under the video as well. Here it explains a little bit about the radio button. It gives you some examples of the radio buttons. Actually, this is a checklist. Radio button is 1 or 2 right here. And we used a very similar example in our code, right, to build this radio buttons, USA, India, or Brazil. The label is going to be what the user is going to see, but the value is going to be different. In most cases, value and label is the same. In our case, the value will be different because in our smart contract, the countries is an enum type, and enum is actually integer. So if somebody chooses USA, this equals 0, this equals 1, and Brazil equals 2, and so on and so on. This just helps save a lot of gas. So this is why the real value is 0, 1, or 2. So initial value is 0. If you refresh the app, the initial value will be USA. This will be the ID of the radio item. An inline true, meaning that it is horizontal and not vertical buttons. And then that's it. Then we repeat ourselves. City is another input field, right? Insert city. And then the last input field is zip code. We're just going to say insert shelter zip code. For all matters and purposes, for the computer, the dash, these are all similar input fields. The only difference, the only thing that makes them different is the ID. This is distinguishes between the input fields. Finally, we have our button here on line 113, DBC button. Say and clicks, initial click 0, because when we first refresh and start the app, it's 0 clicks. Color primary, which is in this case blue. The ID of the button is submit button, and then the text is submit, and that's why you see the text submit. Now this button is wrapped by a whole like HTML div, dash maintain components loading overlay, and stack, and all of this. All of this is just to create the spinning mechanism. Remember, when we click on this, it starts spinning and like loading and disables the button until the shelter is entered into the database, because that takes about 10 seconds. This is using the loading overlay, the spinner. So if you go to this link under the video, let's make this even bigger. Log in. You see, this is the spinner that we are adding to our submit button, right? Click me, a spinner, and then it shows a graph. But in this case, it's just going to insert data into the database. So this is how we did it. We did it with this, just HTML div. I just copied this. If I added spinners to other buttons, and I just copied the whole code, like from here all the way to here, the whole HTML div like spinner component for the overlay, and then I just replaced the button with something else, right? With a different button and a different ID for the other buttons. All right, so this is really the first section, and underneath we have another DBC row, another like 70 lines of code, but it pretty much repeats itself. Another 1, 2, 3, 4 input fields, 2 and 3 sets of radio buttons, right? An input field, line 143, radio buttons again, and it repeats itself because here we're going to allow the user to update the shelter name, their ID. Well, they can't update their ID, but They'll have to put the correct ID, but they'll have to update the city, the country, and anything else they want to update. Is it at capacity? Do they have room for more animals? And so on and so on. So we're just repeating, right? There's nothing new here. Everything is the same. Input field, just the ID is different. And initial value sometimes is different. That's really it. Okay? What is this? This is another input, shelter ID. In this case, the type is number, right? Because it's a number. It's not text. I'm trying to put text here, A, D, T. I can't. It's only a number that can go in here. And that's really it. Here I put in the rated items false, the capacity, because I want the initial value to be false. And then we have another submit button here down below on line 252. Submit that does this overlay thing again, where it will create the spinner while it's inserting data onto the Ethereum Layer 2 blockchain. Lastly, get shelter information, line 265, header 3, and then a label underneath it, and then we just have a simple, we're going to wrap everything, both the input field and the button, inside the loading overlay, right? This right here, both these, input field and the button will be inside of there, so the spinner will be on top of both of them. And all we have to do is put the shelter ID, the user will put the shelter ID, and then we can get the shelter information from the ID, right? Shelter ID 3, spinner, spits out shelter ID 3, shelter ID 1, spinner, shelter ID 1. This is pulling data from the database, but it's doing it with, not from the database, from the blockchain, but it's doing this with the callback down here, which we'll go over in a couple of videos, okay? And that is it. Finish button. This last button right here is going to be used to pull data, multiple shelters, not one shelter, but multiple shelters into a -AG grid table to see which shelters actually have capacity. And we can transfer animals to these shelters in case our own shelter needs space. All right. So I hope this was clear. Again, under the video if you have any questions, and in the next video we'll go over the client side callback.